What's up, DE students? Mr. Martinez here again, about to give you your next episode of the History Talk. Don't remember what History Talk is? Here's a quick reminder. It's your lecture packaged together in a video and puzzled for some check for understandings. As the video is going on, you're allowed to stop as many times as you want to and rewatch as much as you need to in order to really understand what you are learning in this episode. And this episode is an interesting one. One thing that you might not know about U.S. history, and that's going to be a part of Divisive Expansion Part 2 today, where we're going to be looking at the American expansion from east to west and a new development that's happening between 1830 to 1850. Before we get started with all this history, I got to ask you, it's been a while, how are you? No, genuinely, I'm about to ask you to pause and answer this question. How you been? How's it going? Love to know. Thank you for sharing. I just had to ask. I'm curious. But let's get down to business if we can. Today, we are talking about American expansion. And there's a lot of different forms of it and developments that we're going to notice in today. First off, we're talking about the origins of it, this nationalism and the roots of this American expansionism. And we're also going to talk about the acquisition of Oregon, the territory, and how we acquire it. Same thing with Texas, with the Texas Revolution of 1836, along with the the Mexican-American War of 1846 and 1848. A war that is not expressed a lot, but is very important when it comes to the shaping of American identity. We're also going to talk about the events leading to this war and the conduct of the war, and lastly, the impacts of the treaties that are formed. Our essential question for this unit is still, how do you compromise when sides have a powerful, ingrained belief system? Even at this time of American expansion, there are those who believe this is the right thing to do with this nation, and of course, there are those who are thinking this direction will lead to further problems. And today we're going to talk about those developments. So, quick look visualizing what we're doing today. Here's our timeline. We're going to talk about manifest destiny. This is a concept that we've mentioned, and we're going to talk about more today. We saw some of the growing initial moves in our earlier lessons with the Georgia Gold Rush. We've talked the Trail of Tears. Today, like I said, Texas Revolution, all under a new presidency, James Polk, which Mr. Martinez gives big credit for changing the direction of our country. Also moving along with the Oregon Trail and the Mexican-American War. So I've already said the word, you've heard it. It's even the background of Martinez's picture. That, of course, is the manifest destiny. We're talking about this concept of manifest destiny, as this word is coined from the person who created John L. Sullivan, but is really impermeated in our minds of what it is to be American. American expansion, American power, American identity. And at this time, it was shaped to believe that it was America's destiny and that of the American race was destined to claim the entire continent. Had our taste of the East Coast, we've crept through further into the mid-states, but now that we see the West Coast, we see potential. We see economic potential and settlement potential. The only issue, of course, with much of this land is it belongs to somebody else. So how does one justify, how does one conduct business in order to acquire what they want? And how far are we willing to go for that? Well, this desire is called manifest destiny, this want of expansion. There are those who are against this, though. There are people like Henry Clay who are believing that this expansion will further lead to problems Like, for example, the conversation of slavery, which has been constantly been an issue ever since Missouri Compromise, with every new state coming in. What is a state to be deemed, free or slave state? This is a really hot topic and still is, obviously, for this next stage that we've been talking about. And this is all the fear that it's going to destabilize the Union, which is already looking like it has its cracks. But President Polk really needed to come out as president in the campaign. And he was a man of the frontiersman in his eyes. He campaigned that way, where he wanted to support white settlers expanding as much as they want, regardless of the limitations of government oversight. Meaning that these settlers are allowed to continue further expanding, regardless if this land is belonging to somebody else, and to do so in the American way at this time, which is also potentially bringing in slavery. As a lot of this southern territories that we're about to take over, slavery is the big conversation. Talking about slavery, how did America get Texas? Quick conversation on this. America gets Texas with something called the Texas Revolution. And what the Texas Revolution was a time when the Mexican government was promoting more settlers to move up into its northern territories of California, New Mexico, and Texas. And these were largely, despite the indigenous populations, vacant spots in the ideas of the Mexican government. So they wanted to populate and tax the people there. So they encouraged American settlers to come to this land and to occupy it, pay their taxes, do a lease-like system, or they could even eventually become Mexican citizens and be a part of this society. But the thing is that the Texans didn't want that. They had their own identity and they had their own ways. These Texan settlers brought something that was taboo to the Mexican society at this point, which was slavery. Slavery was abolished 30 or so more years before this time period. The Mexican people and its government had decided to abolish it. But these new settlers, these new immigrants were coming in with the practice of slavery, and that complicated things for these people. So there was growing tension between these new white settlers with not following Mexican government rules, and when it came down to paying taxes or converting citizenship, these Texan settlers decided they would rather annex themselves and become independent rather than to be a part of the Mexican government. And this is where it led to the Texas Revolution. These Texans gained their own independence initially without the Americans' assistance. There was some assistance, but not entirely. This was specifically Texans versus Mexicans. And this is like the Battle of Alamo and events like that, where you hear about some of these incidences that happen. But the Texans win. And by this time, later on, by 1836, after it's had a few years of independency, America does acquire it with President Polk, who takes this as a good political opportunity, regardless of the slavery conversation. We're going to see that this is going to lead to some issues, but this is the beginning stages of what will be later the Mexican-American War. But let's pause there real quick, because there's some other manifest destiny that's going on. It's Oregon. It's Pacific Northwest. Now, this territory is a little bit different with the story, as America wasn't the only one who was trying to acquire it. There was other nations who were also claiming stakes to this land. At this time, it was Great Britain. You have to remember, Great Britain owns Canada, and right there, Oregon and Washington's very close, and at this time, Britain was also laying stakes to it. So there was a bit of an issue of who does this land belong to. 1818 citizens could come and go with equal rights to survey and settle. In mid-1840s, the Oregon country in the Pacific Northwest included a native population that had been devastated by disease. The Oregon Trail and these white settlers, of course, bring along new waves of diseases that also wreck the native indigenous populations that were there. Most people coming over were from the mid-states who were looking for that West Coast opportunity. In the election of 1844, the presidential election, this is where you see the big fight between what is left of the Whigs and the rising Democratic Party with James K. Polk. And what he promised was enticing to the voters now that there are campaigns for the average voter. The things he promised were lower tariffs, which is kind of the Southern cause that's been fought for ever since anti-federalism versus federalism. He said he would acquire Oregon, which he did. He did be able to make a deal to be able to acquire it. And also the promising of California and New Mexico, taking this land. Problem here, besides the fact that indigenous populations exist there, is of course that this land is also being claimed by another nation state, which is Mexico. And lastly, creating the independent treasury, which is a newer form of the finance banking. Polk did lower those tariffs. He did create the border line that you see now with Canada and United States, that straight line on the 5440 line. But what he brought was this new level of we are willing to acquire what we would want at the expense of some people and communities. Before we move on to that, though, quick question for you, checkpoint. What are some examples of manifest destiny? Go ahead and answer that question for us real quick. Be able to continue. Good job. Thank you so much. Let's go ahead and continue with this manifest destiny with the big event for today. The big event that Martinez would rather focus on is the Mexican-American War. This is different than all of the other times America has acquired land. It's acquired land from other nations, typically by the exchange of money, so making deals with the French or the Russians or Great Britain, right? There are times where we used violence and force with indigenous communities to acquire land frequently, but this is this different time where the land we want is owned by a different nation, and they said no to our initial financial deals. So what is America going to do? Do we know our boundaries, or do we do the other playbook of using force? Well, as you can see from these pictures, the using of force is the way that we acquire a lot of what we see as the West Coast. So, like I said, we did try to strike a deal. Polk, when he was president, sent Congressman John Slaughter to Los Angeles, which was currently owned by the Mexican government, and gave a proposition saying we were willing to buy New Mexico for $5 million and $20 million for California. Mexican government, not being ignorant, understand the potential of the West Coast and the value of having those coastal cities economically for importation and exportation. So they say, no, it's not worth it. And they have been already trying to settle that land further, so they already have their plans. They weren't looking for it. Well, this doesn't stop America. What we start to see is we go through a playbook where we provoke a war. Now, later in this week, we're going to have a conversation of what is the technical difference between one stealing something and one conquering something. But for just now, what we need to understand is how America provoked this war. There was a contested land in the Nuevo Leon region, which is between Texas and north part of what we think of Mexico today, near around New Mexico. And in that area, we provoked a war by sending a battalion into this contested land, an army into that area, small army battalion. And the Mexican government saw this, as any other nation, as a provoking a war. You're breaking boundary rules, you have a foreign army in your country, you can imagine the anger and steps that one nation would take. And the Mexican government does send a battalion to end the moving force. This makes huge news, especially in America, where you start to see a very different story. You start to see the story that American lives, American blood has been shedded by this Mexican force, where if you look at the historical perspective, you see that it was the Americans stepping into a different boundary and the provoking, essentially. So This leads to Polk being able to ask permission from Congress to declare war, as this is seen as America being the victim rather than the aggressor, and this results to the war. Well, of course, while this is all happening, the conversation of the financial deal with Oregon is happening. But the way we acquire California and New Mexico is by force. Now, there are going to be some of those who criticize Polk for this being one of the first imperialistic moves seen at a new scale. Of course, it's existed, but this is a new scale when doing it to another nation state. And you're going to start to see there's different series to this battles. Mexico tries to fight its great battle, but it cannot withstand the the differences within army organization and technology, and this does lead to Mexico surrendering. Now, there's a lot of different details in there. You can see me trying to spin it in a way that makes it simplistic, especially with Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna, the amazing Mexican general who has some crazy stories on how he definitely made America work for this. But at the end, with the Treaty of Guadalupe, Hidalgo in 1848, you see that Mexico does surrender and give up its land. It gives up the land of California, New Mexico, and Texas. And this is the time where they fully secede this land, where they do not leave it to any contested spots of land. It is more defined to the way that we see it today. Now, answer this question for me real quick. What was the outcome of the Mexican-American War? What was it for at the end, essentially? For right now, can you explain the gist of this? As later on in this week, you'll get more details of the different developments within. Perfect. Thank you so much for doing that. And congratulations, we are already done with this episode of History Talk. I just wanted to set the stage of the overview of Manifest Destiny and the American nationalism that comes from that, the initial developments that are getting us now into the West Coast with different means of acquiring this land, either with financial deals or by force, and ending with the gist of what the Mexican-American War is. And like I mentioned, you will go into much more details with this later on with this week's lesson. But for now, that is it with your history talks. Thank you guys so much for going through the whole lesson, and I look forward to seeing what you guys learned from this week with this topic. I'm Mr. Martinez, and I'm signing out. I'll see you for the next round.